So did you see this? The federal government just updated its advice on what Americans should eat, and it is drawing some scrutiny from nutrition experts who say it conflicts with prior guidance. Let's bring in Mark Kennedy joining us this morning, Senior Vice President of Legal Affairs at the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. Mark, good morning to you. Always nice to talk to another Kennedy, though no relation that I know of. How you doing this morning?
No. Doing all right, cousin. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, we'll check the lineage after this. Hey,
Right.
a lot to unpack here. Let's just start with the basics. How are these guidelines different from the old ones?
I'm an attorney. So for me, the primary difference is the process that went into it. Before, it was a very public process. This time, this was sort of a haphazardly, behind the scenes created committee that drafted guidelines that are very different nutrition wise from prior recommendations. So what we have this time around, contrary to consensus in the science, is recommendations for meat, full fat dairy, low carb diets, fad diets basically, and then almost cautions against plant-based diets after years of sort of trending in that direction under the robust public process that we had until now.
Is there anything when you look at it that you agree with, that you say, okay, well, maybe this is a little better than we had anticipated, better than years past, or are you taking issue
Sure.
with just about it all?
No, there are some positives. It's a shorter document than usual, so in that sense, it's probably easier for the general public to consume, and that is part of the statute that it's supposed to be for the general public. And then there are some, there's a limitation or recommended limitation on consumption of alcohol, and the guidelines do say nice things about eating plants and fruits and vegetables, but not enough. And it's certainly a step back. I don't know if you've seen the diagram that goes along with it, but it's very much a throwback to the old four food groups of the 50s.
And Mark, I saw you quoted in the New York Times in this article discussing some of the conflicts of interest, the alleged conflicts of
Right.
interest, that went on into making these new guidelines. Can you tell me a little bit about that and what you take issue with when it comes to those conflicts of interest?
Sure. In the past, this process went through something called a Federal Advisory Committee under a statute called the Federal Advisory Committee Act, and that was a very public process that spanned years. And there were hearings and public comments. And the idea under FACA is that you have a committee that is fairly balanced. That's one standard, and not inappropriately influenced by a special interest, and that's another standard. And what we had this time was a panel of eight, or I'm sorry, a panel of nine, eight of whom have obvious conflicts of interest, and those interests that they have are reflected in the guidelines. So it's people from the beef industry, people from the fad diets, people who have long supported dairy. And what you saw in that New York Times article is that the experts were handpicked by the administration instead of going through that robust public process. And as a result, we have very conflicted guidelines.
I will tell you, a spokesperson for HHS said that the dietary guidelines were based on a rigorous scientific review and independent oversight, saying it's absurd to suggest that anything other than gold standard science guided our work on this presidential priority. Do you have a response to that statement?
Sure. I mean, this is a really curious process. In the scientific report itself that accompanies the guidelines, there's a whole preamble written by scientists criticizing the process that went before. And that's kind of a political statement that you wouldn't expect in a supposedly scientific document. And again, going back to that New York Times article, these people were handpicked because of the messages that they advance. So the administration wasn't really interested in consensus or what the preponderance of scientific and medical knowledge is. They were interested in a particular message, and that's what we have with these guidelines.
Mark, if I can go back now and talk about your position as Senior VP of Legal Affairs there at Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. What exactly can you do at this point? I understand, I believe you filed a complaint with HHS and USDA about the guidelines. What do you hope to accomplish with that? What are next steps?
Well, the first step was this petition, and we filed it immediately. And it is with the Office of Inspector General for each agency, and that's the body within each agency that is supposed to neutrally and independently assess whether the law was followed in agency action. And then, if we don't get a prompt response to that, we will file a lawsuit.
If these guidelines stand as written, what are your concerns for Americans out there who take them to heart?
Well, these recommendations are going to harm Americans. So recommending a diet that's high in fat, high in full fat, I'm sorry, high in meat, high in full fat dairy. I mean, these are the very things that are the highest in saturated fat, which oddly, the guidelines also say to avoid. So people who consume these things are going to have increased risk of obesity, heart disease, diabetes, and some forms of cancer. And why would you recommend that?
And we actually have the new pyramid pulled up here so our viewers can see it as we follow along. Mark, is there anything I'm not asking that you think is important to the story?
Well, even the pyramid strikes me as a strange development. In years, in about the last 15 years, the USDA had been using a plate, something that makes sense to the consumer. It's got apportionment, you can understand it, you're familiar with that shape. You look at that upside down pyramid, and do you take away anything? Do you know which part is the most important part, or what things to avoid from that? It's another throwback to an earlier time, and it frankly just doesn't make any sense.
Mark Kennedy, Senior Vice President of Legal Affairs at the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. Thank you for your time this morning, sir.
Thank you for having me here.